The morning they came to take everything, Evelyn Mercer was already awake. She heard the truck before she saw it. Tires grinding slow and deliberate up the gravel drive, the way men move when they know you can't stop them. Dale Hutchins stepped out first, county assessor badge catching the pale light, and he didn't even knock. He walked straight to the fence post at the edge of her cornfield, drove a bright orange stake into the cracked earth, and turned to face her with the expression of a man doing arithmetic, not talking to a person. 60 days, Mrs. Mercer. After that, this property reverts to county hold. He said it the way you'd read a grocery list. She was 34 years old. Her husband had been dead 11 weeks, and every single person in Harlan County was waiting, politely, impatiently, for her to fold. If that were you standing in that doorway, what would you do? Before we go any further, if stories like this one move something in you, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit the like button if you believe one person's stubborn heart can change everything, because what Evelyn does next, nobody saw coming. The stake was still wobbling in the wind when Dale Hutchins got back in his truck. He didn't offer condolences. He didn't ask if she needed anything. He just reversed down the gravel drive the same way he'd come up, slow, certain, like a man who'd already written the outcome in his ledger before he arrived. Evelyn stood on the porch in her dead husband's canvas work jacket. The sleeves rolled twice because her arms weren't as long as his had been, and she watched the truck disappear around the bend in the road without moving a muscle. Her neighbor's boy, Tommy Fitch, maybe 16, was leaning on the fence post across the road pretending to fix something. She saw him watching. He looked away the second she caught his eye. By supper time, she knew his mother would have told half of Grover's Hollow that the Mercer widow had been served her notice and didn't even cry. She hadn't cried. Not yet. Not where anyone could see. Inside the farmhouse, the kitchen still smelled like the coffee Thomas used to burn every morning because he always forgot and let the pot sit too long on the heat. She hadn't fixed that habit in 11 weeks. She didn't know why she kept making it that way. Maybe it was the closest thing she had left to hearing him move around in the next room. She sat at the table with the county notice flat in front of her and read it twice, which was once more than she needed. 60 days. Outstanding agricultural liens totaling $4,218. Failure to demonstrate productive crop yield by September 15th would result in property seizure under the Harlan County Land Recovery Act, Section 12, Paragraph 4. Everything was spelled out in the flat, bloodless language of people who deal in land the way others deal in lumber. It's all just material, and sentiment doesn't affect the board feet. Thomas had borrowed against the farm the year before he got sick. She'd known about the loan, sort of. She knew the way you know your roof needs replacing, in the back of your mind, added to the long list of things that get handled eventually. What she hadn't known was that the soil itself had been failing long before the bank got involved. Thomas had known. He talked about it in the way tired men talk about problems they don't have the energy to solve, sideways, quietly, late at night when he thought she was half asleep. She'd listened more than he realized. The fields hadn't produced a real crop in 2 seasons. The ground had gone tight and gray, compacted by years of heavy equipment rolling over the same rows. The natural life pressed down until the soil was closer to packed clay than actual earth. You could stand in the middle of it in August and watch water beat off the surface like the land itself was refusing help. Seeds went in and came up thin, yellowed, struggling. Last year's corn had been just barely enough to call a crop. This year, without intervention, there would be nothing at all. She knew what everyone expected. She'd heard it plainly enough because people in small towns don't always lower their voices when they should. Ruth Finley at the feed store had said it first, or at least first where Evelyn could hear. That woman has no business trying to run that farm alone. Thomas at least knew what he was doing. Old Hap Carter, who farmed 300 acres on the south side of the valley and had strong opinions about everything including weather, had been more direct. He'd stopped her in the hardware store parking lot 2 weeks after the funeral and told her, not unkindly but not gently either, that she ought to think about liquidating while the land still had some value. It's not personal, Evelyn. Farming's hard enough when you've got help. You've got nothing, not enough equipment, not enough hands, not enough time before the county comes calling. She'd thanked him and driven home without buying whatever she'd gone in for. She couldn't remember what it was now. She looked at the orange stake through the kitchen window. It had settled in the ground and stopped wobbling. 60 days. She picked up the county notice and folded it once, very precisely, along the existing crease, then placed it in the drawer beneath the silverware, where she kept documents that needed handling. Then she stood up, put on her husband's jacket properly, and walked out to the field. The soil did everything she'd heard it would do. She kicked at it near the fence line, and it didn't break apart the way good earth should. It cracked, like dried ceramic, in flat pieces that didn't crumble. She dug the heel of her boot in and twisted, and the ground barely yielded. She crouched down and pressed her palm flat against it, the way Thomas had shown her once, years ago, before everything started going wrong. Healthy soil, he'd said, should feel almost springy. Like it's alive, because it is. This felt like pressing your hand against a sidewalk. She stood up and looked at the 50 acres stretching out in front of her and felt something move in her chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite fear. It was something sharper than both. The specific feeling of being handed a problem so large that you can't afford to look at the whole thing at once. She looked at one row instead, just one A1. Then she went back inside and got Thomas's old farm notebooks from the shelf above the fireplace. He'd kept them going back 15 years, and she'd always thought of them as his thing. His handwriting, his observations, his patient recording of rainfall and soil temperatures and what grew, where, and why. She'd never had reason to read them closely. Now she sat at the kitchen table with the oldest one open and read every page in order, slowly, the way you read something you're trying to memorize. Thomas had been curious about things other farmers dismissed. That was one of his qualities she'd loved and occasionally found maddening. He'd read agricultural journals the way some men read sports almanacs, and he'd had opinions about methods that most people in the valley had never tried. In the third notebook, dated 8 years ago, she found 4 pages in his careful handwriting about something called hog tillage. The idea was old, older than most of the equipment rusting in her barn. The principle was plain: pigs root. It's what they do by nature. They push their snouts into earth and turn it over, constantly, restlessly, covering ground in a pattern that mimics deep mechanical tilling, but with a critical difference. They don't compact the soil as they go. Their weight is distributed differently than a tractor's, and what they leave behind, the turned, aerated, waste-enriched earth, can rebuild the biological activity in depleted soil over a matter of months rather than years. Thomas had drawn a little diagram, a rough sketch of a field divided into sections, arrows showing rotation patterns, notes in the margins about timing and density. At the bottom of the page, in the same handwriting that still made her throat close up a little when she saw it on grocery lists or in birthday cards he'd written, "Not fashionable, but it works. Would need to try it properly someday." He never got the someday. She sat with the notebook in her lap for a long time after that. She did the arithmetic twice, which was her habit when she didn't like the first answer. She had 60 days before the county moved on the property. Planting season was already 3 weeks shorter than ideal. She had a soil problem that no single tilling pass would fix. She had no money for chemical intervention, no money for additional equipment, no money for hired hands. What she had was Thomas's diagram and her own particular stubbornness, which various people in her life had described as a character flaw, but which she privately considered her best quality. She needed piglets, not grown hogs. They were too heavy, too expensive, too difficult to manage solo. Young piglets, 6 to 8 weeks old, still small enough that she could handle them alone, but old enough to root seriously. She did the math on acreage and density and arrived at a number that made her set the pencil down for a moment. 28. She checked her savings. The account she'd kept separate from the farm's operating finances, the one Thomas had always called her emergency fund, the one she'd spent 11 weeks telling herself she was saving for an actual emergency. This qualified. She had enough. Barely. Enough for 28 piglets and 2 months of feed, with roughly $40 left over that would need to cover everything else she needed to exist as a human being until the harvest either came in or didn't. $40. She thought about this for a while. She thought about Ruth Finley's voice in the feed store. She thought about Hap Carter in the parking lot with his reasonable eyes and his reasonable advice. She thought about Dale Hutchins and his orange steak and his grocery list voice. She thought about Thomas's handwriting at the bottom of the notebook page. Not fashionable, but it works. She put on her jacket, got in the truck, and drove to the Teller County livestock auction that happened every third Thursday. She got there late, which meant the desirable animals were already spoken for, and what remained in the back pens were the ones the serious buyers had passed on. She walked the pens methodically, the way Thomas had taught her. You don't start at the front, you start at the back, because that's where the overlooked things are, and overlooked isn't always the same as worthless. They were a sorry-looking bunch. She couldn't argue with that. Undersized, most of them, some with patchy coats. The seller, a thin man named Greaves who smelled strongly of cigarettes and mild regret, watched her move down the line with the expression of a man who doesn't want to get his hopes up. "Those are what's left," he said, unnecessarily. "I know what's left means," she said. "How much for 28? He blinked, looked at the pens, looked at her. Did the kind of mental math that men do when they're surprised a woman knows what she wants. 28, he repeated. The whole back run, all the small ones. 28, give or take. I don't need to be exact. He named a price. She countered. They settled somewhere in the middle that left her with $36 instead of 40, and she considered that a reasonable exchange for not having to negotiate any further with a man who kept looking at her like she might change her mind if he just waited long enough. She loaded them herself, mostly, with Greaves holding the gate and watching with the particular expression of someone witnessing something they will later describe to others. The Piglets were unhappy about the trailer. They were loud and muddy and small, and collectively looked like the kind of purchase a person makes when they have given up on sense. She drove home in the early evening with 28 miserable Piglets in the trailer and $36 to her name. And when she turned up her gravel drive, she saw Tommy Fitch across the road again, and this time he didn't even pretend not to stare. By the next morning, half of Grover's Hollow knew. She didn't find out about the laughter directly, which was probably how they preferred it. Most people are more comfortable mocking someone at a comfortable distance. But she felt it, the way you feel weather changing. The feed store was slightly too quiet when she walked in. Two of the women from the church auxiliary who'd been calling to check on her stopped calling. At the gas station, a man she didn't recognize well, a friend of Hap Carter's, she thought, said something to the pump next to him, and both of them glanced at her truck and laughed in the short, certain way of men who have already decided they're right. She filled her gas tank, which cost $4.50, and drove home. The section work started the next day. She'd already divided the field in her head, 8 sections, moving the Piglets through each one in rotation, giving the animals roughly a week per section before she moved them to the next. It was the kind of plan that looked manageable on paper and immediately complicated the moment you're actually standing in a field trying to herd 28 juvenile pigs with 2 sections of temporary fencing and no help. They were not cooperative animals. She hadn't expected them to be. What she hadn't fully anticipated was how loud and how relentlessly busy they would be, rooting and snuffling and pushing at the fence line and occasionally escaping into the section she hadn't meant them to be in yet, requiring her to go in after them and persuade them back, which was a process involving considerable mud and considerable language she wouldn't have used in polite company. By the end of the second day, she ached in places she hadn't known could ache. Her knees were bad. She'd known that since a fall off the barn roof 6 years back. They reminded her now. Every morning when she swung her legs out of bed, the pain had its own small say, and every morning she stood up anyway and put her boots on and went out. She worked the fence sections in the morning and did the rest of the farm maintenance in the afternoon, what little she could manage. And in the evenings, she sat at the kitchen table and checked the sections she'd already processed, crouching down and pressing her palm to the earth the way Thomas had shown her. At the end of the first week, the difference was faint, almost not there, barely enough to notice. But it was there. The soil in the first section had begun to change, not transformed, nothing so dramatic. But where the crust had been sealed and tight, there was now texture. The Piglets had torn through it thoroughly, turning the top 8 to 10 inches, and what showed in the troughs of their rooting was a darker, coarser earth than the gray-packed surface above. It didn't feel like a sidewalk anymore. It felt like something that might, eventually, be willing to grow something. She pressed her palm flat against it and stayed there in the dirt for a moment, alone in a field at dusk with $36 in her pocket and 60 days dissolving, and felt, not hope exactly, not something as clean or comfortable as hope, but a direction. a specific, narrow, impractical direction that was better than no direction at all. She got up, brushed the dirt off her knees, and went to move the piglets to Section 2. 3 days later, Hap Carter drove slowly past on the road. He didn't stop. She saw him through the fence line, sitting high in his cab, and she watched him look at her section fencing and her muddy piglets, and his face did what faces do when someone has already decided to be right. It arranged itself into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't not one either. She waved. He drove on. She had 53 days left, and the corn hadn't gone in yet. In the farmhouse that night, she found herself sitting with Thomas's notebook again, not reading it, just holding it, and she thought about the word he'd used. Someday. The things people put off for someday, the weight those things carry once someday stops being available. She thought about how a man could see something clearly and write it down carefully and still never get the chance to do it, and how that wasn't failure, not exactly, but it was the particular heartbreak of a life interrupted. She wasn't interrupted yet. She put the notebook back on the shelf and went to bed and set the alarm for 5:30. Because Section 3 needed moving and Section 1 needed testing, and there were $36 and 53 days and 28 muddy, loud, completely indifferent piglets that had no idea they were the whole plan. She lay in the dark in the center of the bed that had been too big for 11 weeks and listened to them moving in the field. She didn't sleep for a while, but eventually she did. And in the morning, she got up, put on his jacket, and kept going. Section 2 took 4 days longer than she'd planned. The piglets had found a soft spot along the east fence line, so probably an old drainage channel that had silted over years ago. And 3 of them had rooted down deep enough to work under the temporary fencing and get into the wrong section before she caught it. By the time she noticed, those 3 had been in the unscheduled area long enough to disturb the ground in a pattern that didn't match her rotation map, and she'd spent an entire morning on her hands and knees with a trowel trying to figure out whether the disruption helped or hurt what she was trying to do. It probably helped. She wasn't sure. She marked it in the notebook anyway, Thomas's notebook, because she'd started adding her own notes in the margins in her own handwriting, which felt strange, and then felt less strange, and then started to feel like a conversation she was having with someone who wasn't there to answer back. She noted the drainage channel. She noted the depth of the rooting. She noted that the soil in the accidental section showed the same darkening she'd seen in Section 1, and that it had happened faster, which meant either the drainage channel had kept some residual moisture there, or the pigs had simply worked harder in new territory, the way animals do when the ground is unfamiliar. She wrote, "Pigs go deeper when they're curious, remember this." Then she moved on to Section 3. It was the end of the 4th week when Ruth Finley showed up. Evelyn heard the car but didn't look up right away. She was in the middle of repositioning a fence panel that had been knocked loose by a pig who apparently took fence panels as a personal challenge, and she needed both hands and most of her attention. By the time she straightened up and turned around, Ruth was already at the fence line, standing in her good shoes in the gravel, holding a covered dish with both hands like an offering or a prop. It was hard to tell which. Ruth Finley ran the feed store with her husband Carl, who was a quiet man who seemed to agree with everything Ruth said and had for 30 years. Ruth was not a malicious woman, exactly. She was the kind of woman who collected information about other people the way some people collect figurines, carefully, with categories, displayed where visitors could see. She'd brought a casserole to the funeral. She'd asked questions while she was there that Evelyn had answered briefly and then steered away from. "Evelyn," Ruth said, looking at the pigs with an expression caught between fascination and what she probably thought was concern. "How are you holding up, hun?" "Fine," Evelyn said, which was her standard answer to that question because the real answer was long and she didn't have the energy for it. "Carl and I we've been thinking about you, with everything." Ruth's eyes moved around the field, taking inventory, the fence sections, the piglets, currently loud and busy in Section 3, the condition of the soil in the sections already processed, which from the fence line probably looked like disrupted nothing. What exactly is the plan here?" Evelyn set the fence panel down and pulled off her work gloves. "Soil restoration," she said. "Hog tillage." Ruth's expression shifted slightly. "Hog," she stopped. "I've never heard of that." It's old. Works, though. But the planting window. Ruth said it gently, which was how she said things she considered obvious. Evelyn, you're already late. Carl says if you're not in the ground by... I know when planting season is, Ruth. A brief silence. The pigs filled it. Of course you do, Ruth said, recovering smoothly. We worry. People worry. You're out here alone and he was the farmer, you know? No offense meant by that. Evelyn looked at her steadily. None taken. Can I ask, where'd you get the money for all of this? Because Carl mentioned the county notice, and the bank was... Ruth, her voice was even. Thank you for the casserole. Ruth's mouth closed. She held the dish out over the fence, and Evelyn took it with both hands and said thank you again, which was enough, and they both knew it. Ruth drove away in her clean car, and Evelyn stood there holding a chicken casserole in her dirty hands and watched the road until the car was gone. She ate the casserole that night, and it was actually good, which was the irritating thing about Ruth Finley. She wasn't wrong about everything. Thomas was the farmer. He'd grown up with the land under his fingernails. Evelyn had grown up in a town, married into farming, learned what she'd learned from paying attention to a man who knew things instinctively that she had to work to understand. She didn't have his instincts. What she had was his notebooks and her own specific ability to read something carefully, remember it precisely, and refuse to second-guess it once she'd committed. She'd committed. Section 4 went faster than expected because the soil there had been less compacted to begin with. Something about the grade of the land, the way water moved across it. She noted that too. The piglets seemed to sense it, working more shallowly, moving with less effort, and she let them stay an extra day anyway because extra couldn't hurt. It was during Section 4 that she ran into the feed problem. She'd budgeted the feed carefully, or thought she had. What she hadn't budgeted for was the fact that 28 growing piglets eat differently at week 4 than they did at week 1. They were bigger now, not dramatically, but measurably. And what had been adequate feed volume at purchase was becoming less adequate every week as they grew into it. She did the math and came up short. Not by much. But short was short when you had $36. She drove to the feed store because it was the only option and because she'd decided sometime in the second week that she was not going to be embarrassed out of doing what she needed to do. She walked in and Carl Finley was behind the counter instead of Ruth, which was either better or just different. Carl was a tall man who'd gotten thin in the way some men do after 60, like the years had been drawing him upward and inward at the same time. He looked at her when she came in and nodded, which was about as much greeting as Carl ever managed. She told him what she needed. He wrote it down without commentary, which she appreciated. Then he paused with his pen still on the paper. "You're doing the pig thing," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He nodded again, slower this time. "My grandfather did that," he said, "long time ago, before the county pushed everybody toward the combine system." She looked at him. "Did it work?" Carl considered this with the seriousness he gave to most questions, which was considerable. He said so. I was too young to remember the details, but he never said much that wasn't true, so. He shrugged and finished writing the order. She paid for the feed with 22 of her $36, which left her 14, and drove home with Carl Finley's quiet acknowledgement sitting somewhere in her chest in a place she hadn't expected to need filling. It wasn't encouragement exactly. It was something smaller and more useful, the knowledge that she wasn't inventing something that had never existed. Someone had done this before. Someone had stood in similar dirt with a similar problem and a similar plan and come out the other side. The fact that Carl's grandfather was the someone made it feel both very old and very nearby at the same time, like finding a handprint in dried cement on a road you walk every day. She was halfway through Section 5 when Hap Carter came back. This time he stopped. He didn't get out of the truck right away. He sat with the engine running for a moment, which was a habit of his she'd noticed before. Like he needed a few seconds to decide what version of himself to be before he stepped out into a situation. Then the engine cut off, and he climbed down and came to the fence with his hands in his jacket pockets and the expression of a man doing a calculation he hasn't finished yet. "How many sections?" he asked. She told him, 8 total, 5 done, 3 to go. He looked at the processed sections. the ones she'd already moved the pigs through, where the turned soil had settled and begun to show the darker, looser quality that told her it was working. He looked for a long time without saying anything. "That's quite a lot of ground for one person," he said finally. "Yes. You're behind on planting." "I know." He pulled one hand out of his pocket and rubbed the back of his neck. "Evelyn, I'm not trying to... Look, I own 17 sections of prime land, and I've got 4 hired men and equipment that cost more than this farm is worth on its best day. And some mornings I still feel like I'm one bad season from losing it all. What you're trying to do here..." He stopped. "Is what?" she asked. Not hostile, genuinely asking. He looked at her. "It's a hell of a gamble," he said, which was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in weeks, and she respected him for it. "It is," she agreed. "What happens if it doesn't come in?" She'd thought about this. She'd thought about it at 3 in the morning more than once, lying in the too-big bed listening to the pigs move. "Same thing that happens if I sell right now and walk away. I lose the farm." She kept her voice level. "This way, I at least have a reason to not sleep." Something moved across Hap Carter's face. She couldn't name exactly what it was. Not admiration, or not only that. Something more complicated. The look a person gets when someone says something they recognize from their own life. He didn't offer help. She didn't ask for any. They stood at the fence for another minute, and then he said he had to get back, and he got in the truck, and he drove off slower than he'd arrived. She went back to the fence panel and kept working. Section 6, Day 2, she found a dead piglet. It was one of the smaller ones, the runt of the back pen at the livestock auction, the one she'd privately thought was the least likely to make it. It was lying on its side near the far corner of the section, and it had simply stopped. No obvious injury. No sign of struggle. Sometimes that's how it goes with animals. They come into the world with less than they needed, and they go quietly when the gap becomes too wide. She stood over it for a moment. 27 now. She buried it at the edge of the field because that seemed right, and because she didn't have a better idea. The ground there was already partially worked from the pig's edge rooting, which made the digging easier, and she thought, and then felt strange for thinking it, that at least it went back into the soil that it had helped to fix. Thomas would have said something about that. He was the kind of man who found meaning in circular things. She was not naturally that kind of person, but she was learning to look for it because it helped, and because the alternative was just standing in a field with a shovel feeling bad. She smoothed the soil over, marked the spot with a flat stone she found near the fence line, and went back to work. She was in Section 7, one section away from completion, 10 days behind her original schedule, when the first real interference happened. She'd been aware of Roy Bassett for years in the way you're aware of weather patterns you can't control. Bassett was the largest landowner in the valley, had been since he'd consolidated 3 farms in a single decade through a combination of patience, capital, and a willingness to wait out people in hard times until they had no better option than to sell. He was not a cruel man in the dramatic sense. He was simply a man who discovered early that money and time are the 2 tools that can solve almost any problem if you're willing to use them without sentiment. He'd bought the Hendrick farm 2 years before Thomas died. He'd made an offer on the Mercer property through an intermediary the week after the funeral, which Evelyn had refused without response. She'd heard nothing directly from him since, which she understood to mean he was simply waiting. A man like Roy Bassett doesn't need to push. He just needs to wait until the ground softens on its own. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in a truck that was newer and larger than it needed to be for a man who had people to drive it. He came up the gravel drive this time, not stopping at the road, and parked in the yard like he'd been invited. He was a large man, not fat, but solid. The kind of solid that comes from decades of physical work now maintained by sheer habit. He wore clean boots, which told her he hadn't come to look at the field. He'd come to talk. "Evelyn?" he said when she came out of the barn with a bucket. "Nice morning." "Roy?" He looked around the yard with the easy proprietary gaze of a man surveying things he intends to own. "How are the pigs working out?" She looked at him. "Where'd you hear about the pigs?" He smiled the way men smile when they want to seem harmless. "Small valley." "They're working out fine," she said, and set the bucket down and waited, because she knew what was coming and she preferred to let it arrive without helping it. Bassett clasped his hands in front of him, which she recognized as his version of getting down to business. I want to make you a fair offer, Evelyn. I know what the county notice says. I know where you stand with the bank. And I know, he said this with particular delicacy, that Thomas would have wanted you taken care of. Thomas would have wanted to keep the farm, she said. Thomas was a practical man. So am I. That landed differently than he'd expected. She saw it. The brief recalibration behind his eyes, the slight adjustment of approach. I'm prepared to offer you full assessed value. That clears the bank debt, clears the county lien, and leaves you with enough to— No, she said, settle somewhere comfortably. Roy. No. He stopped, looked at her with the patient expression of someone who has made many offers and knows that first rejections are rarely final. You've got— what? 3 weeks before planting becomes not viable? Even if the soil prep works, you're cutting it dangerously close. I know the timing. And if you miss the window, the county doesn't negotiate. I know that too. He tilted his head slightly, studying her the way you'd study a lock you couldn't quite figure out. What is it you think is going to happen here, Evelyn? Walk me through it. And here was the thing about Roy Bassett. He wasn't stupid, and he wasn't entirely wrong, and she'd have been lying to herself if she pretended that a small part of her didn't hear his version of the future and recognize how possible it was. The county, the window, the 40 days she had left now instead of 60. But possible isn't the same as certain, and she'd learned something in 7 weeks of fence sections and muddy pigs and 3 in the morning arithmetic that she hadn't known how to articulate before. I think, she said slowly, that the soil in sections 1 through 6 is already showing restoration that the county agent would recognize as viable planting condition. I think sections 7 and 8 will be ready within the week. And I think that if I plant corn in the restored sections while the last 2 are still processing, I'll have enough in the ground in time. Bassett looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the field, then back at her. You've been doing the sections in rotation, he said, and his voice had changed slightly. Less salesman, more farmer. While the last ones process, you start planting the first ones. Yes, you'll be planting and pig managing at the same time. I'm aware. He was quiet for a moment, in a way that felt different from his previous quiet. Then, you'll need seed corn. Good seed. That costs money. She didn't answer because she didn't have an answer for that yet. And she wasn't going to lie to Roy Bassett when he already knew the numbers better than most people in the valley. He seemed to understand the silence. He nodded once, put his hands back in his jacket pockets, and walked to his truck. He had his hand on the door when he turned back. Dale Hutchins is a friend of mine, he said. Has been for 20 years. He'll extend professional courtesies where he can. That doesn't mean he can stop the process, but it does mean he'll tell me when it's genuinely too late. He paused. I'm not your enemy, Evelyn. I know that, she said, and meant it. You're just someone who wants my land. He actually laughed at that, a short, real one. Then he got in his truck and drove away. She stood in the yard for a while after he left, thinking about seed corn. The math was simple and bad. Good hybrid seed corn, the kind that could actually produce a competitive yield in restored soil, ran high per pound. She needed enough for 32 plantable acres, which was the estimate she'd made for what sections 1 through 6, plus half of 7 and 8, would yield. At current prices, she was several $100s short of what she needed, more than several, the kind of short that didn't get solved by careful budgeting. She drove to the bank the next morning, which was something she'd been putting off in the way you put off things you already know the answer to. The bank in Grover's Hollow was not a large institution, and its manager, a man named Prescott, who wore the same gray tie every time she'd ever seen him, was not an unkind person, but he was a person governed almost entirely by columns. She sat across from him, and he showed her the columns, and the columns said what she'd expected them to say, that the existing lien consumed any leverage she might have used for a further loan, and that without collateral or a demonstrable income, history and agriculture, the risk calculus didn't work. I'm sorry, Evelyn, he said, and she believed he was, in the way people are sorry for math. She drove home and sat in the kitchen and looked at Thomas's notebook for a long time without opening it. This was the part she hadn't solved. The soil preparation was working, right? She believed that. The evidence said so. The timing was tight but achievable. But without seed corn, the restored soil was just well-turned dirt that the county would take in 38 days. She called her sister in Macon, which cost her dignity she hadn't known she still had. Her sister listened carefully, asked 2 questions, and then told her she could send $200, which wasn't enough, and which Evelyn accepted without saying it wasn't enough, because 200 was 200 and her sister had her own life and her own columns. 200 closer, still not enough. She sat on the porch that evening and watched the pigs in Section 7 work the ground in the long last light, and she thought, not for the first time but with more focus than before, about what Thomas would have done. Not the Thomas of the last years, tired and sick and already beginning to lose the argument with his own body. The earlier Thomas, the one who'd read agricultural journals by lamplight and drawn diagrams in notebooks, and said things like, not fashionable, but it works with the particular confidence of a man who believed in what he could see with his own eyes. He wouldn't have sat on the porch. He would have made a list. He would have written down every person who owed him something, every favor outstanding, every relationship that had accumulated enough goodwill to convert into a request. She went inside and got a piece of paper. The list was shorter than she'd have liked. Thomas had been a man who preferred to give favors over asking for them, which was admirable, and also left a thinner ledger to draw on. But it wasn't empty. There was Art Prentice, who farmed east of the highway, and whose fence Thomas had helped repair 3 summers running without being asked. There was Delia Marsh, who'd lent Thomas her husband's old disc harrow for a full season after the Mercer equipment broke down. And there was Carl Finley, who'd said quietly that his grandfather had done this same thing, which wasn't a debt, but might be a door. She called Art Prentice first. He picked up on the 3rd ring and listened while she explained. Not the whole story, just the relevant facts. The soil prep, the timeline, the seed gap. There was a silence when she finished. "How much corn are you trying to put in?" he asked. She told him. Another silence, shorter this time. "I've got leftover seed from last season, good hybrid stock. I overbought, which I do every year and then kick myself for. I'd have to look at exactly how much, but maybe enough for 15, 16 acres. It wasn't 32, but it was half of 32, and half was better than a column of zeros. What do you want for it?" she asked, because Art Prentice was a generous man, but he was also a farmer, and farmers account for things. "Winter squash," he said. "If you've got a good year, 2 bushels. She almost said, "I haven't planted winter squash." Then she thought, she could plant winter squash. She had the space. "Done," she said. She called Delia Marsh next, who wasn't home, and left a message. Then she sat with the paper in front of her and crossed Art Prentice's name off the list and looked at the remaining gap and thought about Carl Finley. She wasn't sure what she was going to ask him. She wasn't sure he had anything to offer, but he'd mentioned his grandfather, and people don't mention things like that for no reason. They mention them because something in the conversation called it up, and what had called it up was her, doing what she was doing, which meant some part of Carl Finley had recognized what she was doing as a thing worth mentioning. She drove to the feed store the next morning at 7 before Ruth arrived, and Carl was there alone unlocking the back entrance. He looked unsurprised to see her, which might have meant something, or might have just meant Carl was difficult to surprise. She told him where she was. The soil sections, the timing, the seed gap, the 200 from her sister, and the 16 acres from Art Prentice. All of it, laid out in order, the way Thomas used to present a problem. No drama, just sequence. Carl listened without interrupting, which was how he did most things. When she finished, he stood there for a moment with his key still in the lock and his head slightly tilted. And then he said, "Ruth's cousin has a seed operation over in Baines County. Sells direct, no distributor markup. I can make a call." She looked at him. "That would help." "It won't be free," he said, "but it'll be less. And I can put part of it on account if you need." She thought about her list. She thought about 38 days. She thought about Thomas's handwriting in the margin of a notebook that was really, at this point, half hers. "Yes," she said. "Please." Carl nodded and opened the back door and went inside, and she stood there in the early morning with the day already starting to warm up around her, and something in her chest released a pressure she hadn't fully realized had been building since Prescott's gray tie and his column of zeros. It wasn't solved, not even close to solved. She still had 2 sections to finish. 38 days left, a fragile seed arrangement, $14 in her pocket, and the entire valley watching with the particular attention of people who have already decided how a story ends. She had 27 pigs, 1 trowel, 1 dead husband's notebook, and a plot of ground that was slowly, imperfectly, stubbornly becoming something that might grow things again. She went back to the farm and put the pigs in Section 8 and picked up her tools and got to work, because the morning wasn't going to use itself, and the ground didn't care about any of it. It only responded to what you actually did to it, not what you planned, or hoped, or feared. Section 8. Last one. 38 days. The corn wasn't in the ground yet, and the sky above the valley was bright and hot and cloudless in a way that, if she'd been paying a different kind of attention, might have told her something about what was coming. She wasn't paying that kind of attention yet. She was paying the kind you pay when you're on your knees in the dirt, checking soil with your hands, looking for signs of life in ground that everyone else had already given up on. What she found, when she pressed her palm flat against the earth in Section 8 on the first day she ran the pigs through it, was warmth. Not just the warmth of the August sun on the surface, but something deeper, a faint, living warmth that comes from biological activity, from the invisible machinery of microbes and root systems and organic matter beginning to do the slow, unglamorous work of turning dead ground back into living soil. It was there. Faint, but there. She took her hand back and looked at the dirt on her palm and thought, "All right, Thomas, we're doing this." The seed corn from Carl Finley's connection in Baines County arrived on a Thursday, 2 days later than promised, in the back of a sun-bleached delivery truck driven by a teenager who seemed surprised to find himself at a working farm and not a warehouse loading dock. She checked the bags before she signed anything. Carl had told her to do that, had told her specifically what to look for. The moisture seal, the germination date stamp, the variety code that corresponded to what she'd ordered. Everything checked. She signed, the truck left, and she stood in the yard with 31 bags of hybrid seed corn stacked around her boots, and felt something that was not quite relief, because relief implied the hard part was over. The hard part was beginning. She'd done the final walk of Section 8 that morning, and the soil had told her what she needed to know. 6 weeks of pig rotation had done what Thomas's notebook said it would do, what Carl's grandfather had apparently known decades before anyone was writing it into journals. The ground was not perfect. She wasn't sure it would ever be what it had been before the years of heavy equipment and neglect had pressed the life out of it. But it was workable. It was genuinely, measurably workable in a way it hadn't been when Dale Hutchins drove his orange stake into it and read her the county's arithmetic. She moved the pigs to a holding pen she'd built along the north fence line, temporary, tight, the kind of construction you do in a hurry with what you have. They were unhappy about it. They communicated this at length and volume. She ignored them with the practiced deficiency of a woman who had spent 6 weeks being communicated at by pigs and had learned that acknowledgement only encouraged them. She started planting on Sections 1 and 2 first, because those had the most recovery time behind them. She did it the way Thomas always had, by hand for the first pass, checking depth and spacing, getting a feel for how the soil was accepting the seed before she committed to a pattern across the whole expanse. The first row took her most of the morning. She pulled a seed free from the ground after she'd placed it and looked at the soil clinging to it, felt it between her fingers. It was dark, not gray. It broke apart when she pressed it rather than cracking in the flat ceramic pieces she'd learned to dread. She put the seed back, firmed the soil over it, and kept going. By the end of that first week, she had Sections 1 through 4 planted and Sections 5 and 6 half done. Her knees were communicating their opinions about this schedule with increasing clarity. She was waking up at 4:30 without an alarm because her body had apparently decided that was the appropriate time to begin cataloging every muscle she'd used the day before. She drank coffee that was too strong because she kept forgetting the pot, the way Thomas used to forget. And every morning the smell of burned coffee hit her first thing, and she thought about him briefly, sharply, and then moved on, because you can grieve and plant corn at the same time if you have to. She did not have help, with one exception that arrived unexpectedly. Tommy Fitch appeared at the fence line on a Saturday morning. The same boy who'd been watching from across the road since the beginning, who'd looked away every time she'd caught his eye. He was there when she came out of the barn at 5:15, standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he didn't look away this time. "My dad said I shouldn't," he said, by way of greeting. She stopped and looked at him. "Shouldn't what?" "Come over here. He said you'd run me off." She hadn't planned to run anyone off. "What do you want, Tommy?" He shrugged in the way of teenage boys who want something but haven't figured out how to ask for it directly. "I can plant," he said. "I know how. My dad farms, so." Another shrug. "I've got 3 weeks before school starts back." She looked at him for a moment. He was 16 or 17, she thought, lanky and serious-faced in the way of boys who've spent time around adults and picked up their postures without quite filling them yet. His father was Dale Fitch, who farmed a modest spread on the north end of the valley, and was not, as far as she knew, an ally of Roy Bassett's, and not particularly a friend of her own. A neutral party, which was its own kind of value. "I can't pay you," she said, because she couldn't, and honesty was easier than negotiating around it. "I know," Tommy said. "My dad's going to be mad anyway, so I might as well do it for free." Something about that answer, the crooked logic of it, the particular teenage calculus that arrives at generosity through defiance, made her want to smile, which she didn't because she needed him to understand she was serious. 6 days a week, she said, sun up to noon. I'll feed you lunch. Tommy nodded like this was reasonable. And you do what I tell you, not what seems right to you. This is my field and my method, and I don't have time to fix mistakes. Yes, ma'am. He started the next morning. He was not a natural. He overspaced the first row and had to go back and correct it, and he asked more questions than she'd expected, which slowed things down but also told her he was actually thinking about what he was doing rather than just going through motions. By the third day, he was working at a pace she didn't have to monitor constantly, and that freed her hands for the sections where the soil needed more attention. She heard later, through the particular telephone of small-town information, that Dale Fitch had called his son a fool twice, and then driven past the Mercer farm 3 times in 1 week, slowing down each time. She didn't know what to make of that, and didn't have the energy to try. The corn went in, row by row, section by section, with 18 days left before the county deadline, when she pressed the last seed into Section 8's newly restored earth and stood up straight and looked at 50 acres of planted ground for the first time in 2 years. It didn't look like much yet. Bare soil in rows, mostly, with the faintest hint of green on the earliest planted sections where the first shoots were just beginning to crack the surface. Nothing anyone driving past would point at and say, there, that's working. But she knew what was underneath it, because she'd put it there. And she knew what the soil felt like now versus what it had felt like 8 weeks ago. And those 2 things together were enough to sustain her through the 3 days of waiting that followed, during which she checked the earliest shoots about 12 times daily in the manner of a person who knows. Checking it won't make it grow faster but cannot help herself. The shoots were there. They were green and upright, and they were coming in evenly across the section, which meant the germination rate was holding, which meant the soil conditions were what she'd thought they were. She noted everything in the notebook, margins and margins of her own handwriting alongside Thomas's, the 2 of them building a document between them that no longer felt strange, that felt, honestly, in the private place where she allowed herself to feel things, like the closest thing to a conversation she'd had with him since he died. It was the 2nd week of August when the heat changed. She noticed it first as a quality of light, the way the air over the valley had a different density to it in the mornings, sitting heavier, holding whatever warmth the previous day had left, instead of releasing it overnight the way it usually did. By the 3rd week of August, the creek that ran along the eastern property line had dropped 4 inches from its previous mark. By the 4th week, the grass on the roadside verges had gone yellow and stiff, and the topsoil in the valley's lower fields was beginning to show the fine cracking pattern that happens when the moisture has been drawn out faster than it can be replaced. The word went around the valley the way bad news always goes around a small farming community, quickly, with everyone knowing before anyone says it officially. Drought. Not the casual kind, not the 2-week dry spell that makes farmers nervous but doesn't kill anything, the real kind. The kind that settles in and makes itself at home and doesn't negotiate. Evelyn was checking soil moisture on Section 3, her oldest planted section, 3 weeks in, with corn at nearly knee-height now, when the implications of the cloudless sky above her finished assembling themselves into a complete thought. She pressed her palm to the soil between two rows and felt what she'd feared feeling, dry. Not bone dry, not yet, but the kind of dry that was heading toward bone dry with nothing to stop it. She looked at the sky for a long time. Then she went and got the notebook. Thomas had written about drought twice, once in an early notebook that was mostly technical notes, and once, more personally, in the 7th notebook, the last full one he'd kept before he got sick. In the 7th notebook, he'd written about moisture retention in soil and the relationship between organic matter content and water holding capacity. And what he'd written, in the patient certain way he had, was this: compacted soil sheds water. Restored soil holds it. The difference in a dry year is everything. She read that 3 times. Then she walked the entire 50 acres slowly, section by section, pressing her palm to the earth between rows, feeling for temperature and moisture with the deliberate attention of someone taking a patient's vital signs. What she found was not uniform, and the variation told a story she hadn't fully anticipated. Sections 1 and 2, the first she'd processed, the ones that had had the longest recovery time, held moisture noticeably better than the edge rows of Section 8, which had gone in last and had the shallowest restoration depth. The difference was real. You could feel it through your palm. Where the pig tillage had gone deepest and been given the most time to settle, the soil had developed a crumb structure that held water in small pockets between particles, rather than letting it sheet off the surface the way compacted ground does. Where the restoration was shallowest, the edges, the corner sections, the spots where the pigs had worked less thoroughly, the soil behaved more like the old ground, and the crop there was already showing the first signs of heat stress. This was not a discovery she had time to feel good about. It was a problem with the shape, and she had to find a way around the shape. She walked the whole farm twice more that day and made a map in the notebook of which sections were moisture-holding well, which were marginal, and which were concerning. Then she made a second map of which sections had the most advanced corn growth. The 2 maps overlapped significantly, but not perfectly, and the places where they didn't overlap were going to be the places that cost her. The well water was still running. The farm had a hand-dug well that Thomas had deepened 8 years back, and she had a gravity irrigation system that predated both of them. Old iron pipe, some of it replaced with newer sections at different times, running along the high end of the property, and gravity fed down through the sections. The system worked. It was slow, and it covered only about 60% of the planted area without moving the pipe connections, and moving the pipe connections was a full day's work each time. She started running the irrigation on a schedule that prioritized the marginal sections over the strong ones, which felt counterintuitive but was correct. The sections that were already holding moisture well could manage on less for now, while the marginal sections needed the supplemental water immediately, or they'd tip into the concerning category. She explained this to Tommy, who had continued showing up every morning regardless of what his father thought about it, and Tommy listened and asked whether it wouldn't be better to water everything equally. "If I had unlimited water and unlimited time, yes," she said. "I don't. So I decide what needs the most help, and I help that first." He thought about this. "Triage," he said. "Yes. My dad does that with his fields too," Tommy said, "but he calls it cutting your losses, which sounds worse." She looked at him. "It is worse. Cutting your losses means you've already given up on the parts you're not helping. I haven't given up on anything." Tommy didn't say anything to that, but he looked at the field for a moment with an expression that was a little too old for his face, and then he went and repositioned the irrigation pipe where she'd told him to. The 3rd week of August was the worst. The temperature on the valley floor hit 94 on a Tuesday and held there for 5 days without dropping below 80 overnight. The creek dropped another 3 inches. The road verges were brown. Cattle in the fields of other farms were clustering near any shade they could find by mid-morning. Hap Carter lost his south wheat field entirely. It went brown and flat in a week, and he'd stopped irrigating it, which told her he'd made the same calculation she was trying to avoid making. The Deering farm, which sat in the low part of the valley where drainage was poor and the soil was heaviest, began to show wilting in its corn by the 2nd day of the heat, and by the 5th day it was unmistakable even from the road. She drove past Deering's on her way back from picking up irrigation fittings in town and saw the field and felt something she wasn't proud of feeling, a quick, desperate hope that her own field was doing better, followed immediately by guilt for feeling it because Jim Deering was a good man with 4 kids and a mortgage, and his failing crop was not a point in her column. Her own field was doing better, not good, better, which were different things, and she was careful not to confuse them. The sections with the deepest restoration, 1, 2, and 3, were holding. The corn there was stressed. You could see it in the way the leaves were beginning to cup slightly in the afternoons to reduce their surface area, which is what corn does when it's managing heat load. But it was not wilting. It was not collapsing. The root systems in the restored soil had gone deeper than she'd expected, following the organic matter channels the pig rooting had created. And deep roots reach moisture that shallow roots cannot. She noted this. She noted the specific rows and the specific depth indicators and the date and the temperature and everything she could observe, because Thomas had taught her that observation is only useful if you record it, and because she understood now that she was recording something that extended well beyond this single season on this single farm. The concerning sections were genuinely concerning. Sections 7 and 8, the last processed, the shallowest restoration. The corn there was behind in height and showing more heat stress than she'd like. She increased the irrigation allocation to those sections and reduced it on sections 1 and 2, which could take the reduction, and held her breath in the figurative sense because holding your breath doesn't actually help corn grow. It was during this stretch, the worst 5 days of heat, that Roy Bassett came back. He didn't come alone this time. He brought a man she didn't recognize, younger than Bassett, with the particular quality of attentiveness that told her he was being paid to be there rather than choosing to be. Bassett's lawyer, she thought, or someone positioned similarly. The two of them stood at her fence line, and Bassett called out to her in the field, and she came over because ignoring Roy Bassett didn't make him leave. It just made him wait longer. He looked at her corn. He looked at it for a long time before he said anything, which was its own kind of statement. A man taking careful inventory of something he's deciding how to price. Still standing, he said. It sounded like a concession and a question at the same time. Still standing, she agreed. Bassett glanced at the man beside him, then back at her. I've revised my offer, he said. Upward, given the work you've put in. She looked at the man with him. Who's he? My associate. Does your associate have a name? The man said, Hargrove. Like that was enough, like last names were currency he was careful with. She looked back at Bassett. What's the new number? He told her. It was higher, meaningfully higher, than the first offer. High enough that she felt a physical response to it, a cold and hot thing in her sternum that she recognized as the sensation of being genuinely tempted by something she didn't want to want. The number was enough. Enough to clear everything, enough to go somewhere, enough to start over without the knees and the 4:30 mornings and the drought and the orange steak and the whole exhausting weight of it. She stood in the heat of the 3rd week of August with dead brown valley around her and green corn at her back and felt the full weight of Roy Bassett's number for about 20 seconds. No, she said. Bassett's jaw moved slightly. Hargrove wrote something down. Evelyn, Bassett's voice had dropped the salesman quality entirely now. What was underneath it was something she respected more, saw a direct appeal from one person to another. You've got, 8 days before the county deadline? The drought isn't breaking. The forecast through the end of the month is dry. Even if your crop holds, yield in these conditions will be down. You might not clear enough to make the county payment, even if you harvest everything you've got. He wasn't wrong. She'd done that math too. I know, she said. Then why? She thought about how to answer that. She thought about sections 1 and 2, where the roots were going deep and the soil was holding water that the valley's other fields were losing to the surface. She thought about the difference she'd felt under her palm 8 weeks ago and the difference she felt now. She thought about Thomas's diagram and his handwriting and a dead piglet and a 16-year-old boy whose father didn't want him here and Carl Finley's grandfather and Art Prentice's winter squash. Because the soil is different, she said. Whatever happens with this harvest, the soil is different than it was. That doesn't go away. That stays. Bassett looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the corn again, and this time the inventory expression was gone, and something else was there that she couldn't fully read. 8 days, he said quietly. I know, she said. He and Hargrove left. She went back into the field. It was Tommy who noticed the change first, 5 days before the deadline. He was repositioning irrigation pipe on Section 6 when he stopped and stood up straight and looked toward the southwest with the squinting focus of a boy who'd grown up watching weather. She saw him from Section 4 and stopped what she was doing. What? She called. He didn't answer right away, then, Mrs. Mercer, come look at this. She crossed to him and looked where he was looking. The sky to the southwest had a different quality. Not the hard bleached blue that had been over them for 3 weeks, but something with more dimension to it, a thickness at the horizon that had weight and movement behind it. She felt the air on her face. There was something in it that hadn't been there in the morning, a faint atmospheric pressure shift, the kind that doesn't mean anything by itself, but combined with that sky and that horizon, meant the thing she'd been watching for since the heat started. How long? Tommy asked. He meant until rain. She didn't know. Could be nothing, she said. Could be tomorrow. Tommy looked at her sideways. But you think it's something. She did. She didn't say so out loud because she was aware that hope in farming is a resource you spend carefully, and she'd been spending it very carefully for 8 weeks. But she looked at that southwest sky for a long moment before she went back to work, and something in the arithmetic of her chest rearranged itself into a different configuration than it had been holding since the heat started. 2 days before the county deadline, Dale Hutchins drove up the gravel drive again. He had the same badge, same clipboard, same grocery list manner as the first time, and she met him in the yard with her arms at her sides and her face arranged into nothing that would help him or hurt her. He looked at the corn. Whatever he'd expected to see, this wasn't it. Mrs. Mercer, he said in a voice that had lost some of its flat professional certainty, the deadline for demonstrating viable yield is day after tomorrow, she said. I know. He looked at the corn again. You could see the internal accounting happening. The man who'd driven out here expecting to complete a process encountering conditions that complicated the completion. This is further along than the assessment projected, he said. Yes, she said. It is. The drought assessment suggested the valley yield would be significantly reduced. The county used that projection for all properties in the affected area. The county's projection was based on compacted soil, she said carefully, which doesn't hold moisture the way restored soil does. Hutchins was quiet for a moment. He was looking at sections 1 and 2, which were the most advanced, where the corn stood strong and green and healthy enough that even a man whose expertise was administration rather than agriculture could see the difference between it and the brown-edged fields visible in other directions across the valley. I'll need to document the current stand assessment, he said. For the record. Go ahead, she said, and stepped back and let him walk the section edges with his clipboard, and watched him write things down in his careful administrative way, and felt, not victory, because it wasn't victory yet, but the specific sensation of having stayed in the room long enough to change the terms of the conversation. He left without saying what she wanted him to say, because Dale Hutchins was not the kind of man to say anything before he'd entered it into the right column. But he left differently than he'd arrived, and she stood in the yard and watched the truck go and looked at the southwest sky, which was darker and more substantial than it had been that morning. That night she sat on the porch and didn't go inside until nearly midnight. The pigs were quiet in their north pen, settled in the way they got when the temperature dropped, which it had, 3 degrees lower than the previous night, which didn't sound like much but felt, after 3 weeks of relentless heat, like the air itself was releasing something it had been holding too long. She sat with Thomas's notebook in her lap without opening it, just the weight of it, the fact of it. She thought about what she'd said to Roy Bassett. The soil is different. That stays. She believed it. She believed it as a statement of agricultural fact, and she also believed it in the other way, the way things become true on a different level when you've worked for them past the point where the working made sense to anyone watching. She was not the same person who had stood in this yard on the morning Dale Hutchins first drove his orange stake into her ground. She was not better or worse, not wiser in any tidy way she could explain. Just different in the way that ground is different when it's been turned, more open to what comes next, more able to hold what falls on it. She went inside at midnight and set the alarm for 4:30 and lay in the too-big bed and listened. The first sound of rain came at 2 in the morning, so gentle at first that she wasn't sure she was hearing it and not imagining it. She lay still and listened, and then it was unmistakable, the sound of water on the roof and on the dry ground outside. And she lay there in the dark with her eyes open and listened to the valley begin to drink. She did not get up. She did not go to the window. She lay there and let it happen over her and around her and outside her, and felt something that she had not felt in a long time. Not since before Thomas got sick, maybe not since long before that, which was the particular quiet of a person who has done everything they could do and is now, finally, in the hands of something larger than themselves. Not surrender, not relief, just the end of the part where she had to carry it alone. The rain fell on Section 1 and Section 2 and Section 3, and the sections that were worried and the sections that were holding and the restored soil that had changed beneath her hands and was different now in the permanent fundamental way of things that have actually been changed and not merely rearranged. It fell on the north pen where 27 pigs were probably pressing together for warmth. It fell on the orange stake that Dale Hutchins had driven into her ground 10 weeks ago, though she didn't think about that specifically. She thought about Thomas briefly in the way she'd learned to do it, directly, without apologizing for the pain of it. It worked, she thought. Your idea worked. Then she closed her eyes, and the rain kept falling, and she slept. The rain fell for 2 days. Not the violent kind. Not the storm that breaks levees and fills creeks to their banks overnight. The slow kind. The patient, steady, agricultural kind that soaks rather than sheets, that enters the ground rather than running off it, that a farmer feels differently in the body than a person who has never watched soil drink. It rained through the night she'd finally slept, and it rained through the next morning, and by the afternoon of the second day, it had tapered to a fine mist that sat over the valley like something that had decided to stay a while. She was in the field before the rain fully stopped. She knew what she was looking for, and she found it in Section 1 first, because Section 1 always told her things first. She crouched between 2 rows and pressed her palm flat to the ground and felt the moisture sitting in the soil at a depth she hadn't been able to reach with the irrigation alone. It wasn't pooling. It was absorbed, held in the crumb structure that 6 weeks of pig tillage had built into the earth, sitting in the microscopic spaces between particles the way water sits in a sponge rather than running off the surface of a tile. The soil had taken the rain and kept it, which was the whole theory, which was Thomas's diagram, and Carl's grandfather, and 2 months of her life made real and wet and functional under her palm. She stayed crouched there for longer than she needed to, just feeling it. Her knees were going to complain later. She didn't care. The corn in Sections 1 through 3 had already visibly responded to the rain overnight. The leaves had uncupped, the stress posture they'd held during the worst of the heat reversing itself as the plant's water availability changed. They were upright and broad, catching the remaining mist, and the color had deepened from the slightly yellow-edged green of heat stress to something richer and more certain. She walked the rows slowly, looking at each plant the way Thomas had taught her, not just at the visible growth, but at the stalk thickness, the internode spacing, the way the plant was distributing its resources between height and ear development. What she saw was not perfect. She'd been farming long enough, or at least watching Thomas farm long enough, to know that perfect was a word that didn't belong in fields. Section 7 and the east edge of Section 8 were behind. The shallower restoration there had limited what the rain could do in the short term, and those plants were going to yield less than the stronger sections regardless of what happened from here. She noted it without panicking about it, the way you note a crack in a wall. Something to know, something to account for, not something to catastrophize. The critical thing, the thing that mattered against the backdrop of the county deadline and Roy Bassett's offers and Dale Hutchins's clipboard, was the overall stand. She walked all 50 acres that morning in the fine mist, counting and measuring and pressing her hands to the earth at intervals. And what she arrived at by noon was a number that she wrote in the notebook twice because she wanted to be sure she'd gotten it right. Viable yield projection, accounting for the weaker sections. Enough. Not triumphant, not record-breaking, not the kind of number that would make anyone write articles. Enough to make the county payment with a margin. Enough to cover the bank lien. Enough to keep the farm. Enough was everything. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open and the numbers written in her own handwriting next to Thomas's older numbers when she heard the truck in the drive. She knew the sound of it by now. The particular engine note of a vehicle that was maintained but not babied, driven by someone who used it as a tool rather than a statement. Hap Carter. He was standing at the edge of Section 2 when she came out, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the corn the way he'd looked at it the first time he'd really looked at it. Not the casual appraisal of a man confirming what he already thought, but the more careful attention of someone revising his thinking. She walked out and stood next to him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, which with Hap Carter was a form of communication. "The rain hit you well," he said finally. "Yes. The Deering field lost about 40%, based on what I could see from the road." She didn't say anything to that. "Mine came through better than I expected on the north parcels." He paused. "South wheat is gone. I told you that already, I think." "You did?" He looked at her corn for a while longer. "Your sections, the ones the pigs went through longest, they're holding better than anything in the valley right now. You can see the difference from the road. People have been seeing it." She looked at him sideways. "What people?" It wasn't a question exactly. He answered it as one anyway. "Most people. Roy Bassett, Dale Hutchins, who mentions things in a professional capacity to people he's known for 20 years, which I've told you about." He shifted his weight. "Word is Hutchins filed his assessment this morning. Viable yield, current stand conditions consistent with debt service capacity." He said it in the flat official cadence of a man quoting something he'd heard verbatim. She let that sit for a moment. "He filed it. This morning, before the deadline." She looked at the corn. She felt something happen in her chest that she didn't have a word for. Not relief, which she'd been telling herself not to feel prematurely for 2 months. More like the specific sensation of setting down something very heavy that you've been carrying so long, you'd forgotten the weight had a specific shape. "Okay," she said. Hap looked at her. "Okay," he repeated in the tone of a man who had expected a larger response. "What do you want me to do, Hap? Cry?" "Most people might." "I'll cry later," she said, "when there's time." He made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had gone a little further. Then he was quiet again for a moment, looking at her field, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into a different register. Not the neighborly one, not the farmer-to-farmer one, but something more direct and less comfortable. "I owe you an apology," he said. "The parking lot. What I said. You said it honestly." "I said it like the outcome was already decided," he said. "That's not the same as honest." She thought about this. It was, she felt, an important distinction. "All right," she said. "Apology accepted." He nodded. He didn't look relieved exactly. Hap Carter was not a man who performed his feelings on his face, but something settled in his posture. "If you ever need a hand with equipment," he said, "I've got machinery sitting idle between seasons. It's not charity, it's just sitting idle doesn't help anybody." She looked at him. "I'll keep that in mind." He nodded again and went back to his truck and drove off. And she stood there in the light mist and watched him go and thought about the parking lot and what he'd said there, and how wrong he'd been, and how much it had cost her, and how she still didn't entirely blame him for it because at the time the evidence had supported his conclusion. That was the thing about evidence. It only tells you about what's already happened. It can't tell you about what someone is willing to do. Tommy Fitch came back the next day, even though school had started, which told her something about his priorities that she suspected was going to cause problems at home. He showed up at 6:30 looking slightly guilty and entirely determined, and she was not going to send him away because she still needed hands, and because she'd developed over the course of 3 weeks of side-by-side work a kind of unspoken regard for him that didn't require examination. "Don't you have school?" she said. "It started yesterday," he said, which was technically not an answer. "Tommy." "I'll go tomorrow," he said. "I just wanted to see—" He looked at the corn. The rain had done visible things to it overnight, the kind of visible things that accumulate in your absence and then land all at once when you look. It grew, he said, with the specific wonder of someone who has intellectually understood that corn grows but has not fully felt it until this moment. That's what it does when the conditions are right, she said. He walked along the section one row slowly, looking at the plants with an attention that she recognized as genuine rather than performed. He was at the age where everything is still new enough to actually see, before the years of seeing something repeatedly cause you to stop looking at it. She watched him and thought about what he was going to remember about this summer. Not the fence panels and the mud and the sore back and the heat, probably, but this. The morning after the rain when the corn had grown. "Mrs. Mercer," he said without turning around, "what happens to the pigs now?" She'd been thinking about that. The pigs had served their purpose. The tilling was done, the soil was changed, they weren't needed in the same way anymore. But they were still 27 animals she'd purchased and was responsible for, and the options for 27 juvenile pigs at the end of their working period were limited and mostly pointed in one direction. "Market," she said, "when the time is right." He turned around and his face had the expression of someone who has understood something and doesn't like it but recognizes it as true. "They did all that work," he said. "They did," she said. "They also ate everything in reach and escaped 17 times and made a noise I'm not going to miss." She paused. "They were pigs, Tommy. They did exactly what pigs do, and it helped me, and now the arrangement is finished. That's how farming works." He was quiet for a moment. "My dad says farming makes you hard." She thought about that. "Your dad's not entirely wrong," she said. "But there's a difference between being hard and being honest. Honest is, you let it matter while it matters, and you don't pretend it didn't matter after." She stopped, because she wasn't sure she'd meant to say all of that. "Go to school tomorrow." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he spent the rest of the morning helping her check soil moisture readings across the sections, which he did with a precision that suggested he'd been paying attention to what she'd been teaching him without either of them formally acknowledging that she'd been teaching him. The week after the rain was the week the valley began to understand what had happened. It started quietly, the way realizations start in communities that are suspicious of drama, with people slowing down on the road, with conversations at the feed store that stopped when she walked in and then continued differently after a moment. She was aware of it the way you're aware of weather, not always looking directly at it, but knowing it's there. Jim Deering stopped her at the gas station on a Wednesday. He was a quiet man, heavier than he used to be, with the particular tiredness of someone carrying a season that has not gone well. He said hello and then stood there for a moment with his hand on his truck door. "My north field held better than my south," he said finally. "Always has. Been trying to figure out why for years. The drainage is different, I thought. Or the grade." He paused. "But it's the soil. The north section. My grandfather used to pen his hogs there in the winter. Never thought about it." He looked at her. "I'm thinking about it now." She didn't know what to say to that. She said, "Carl Finley knows a man in Baines County who sells direct. Good stock." Deering nodded slowly. "I might ask Carl about that." He got in his truck and drove off, and she stood at the pump and thought about Carl's grandfather and Thomas's notebook and the particular way that knowledge moves through a farming community, not like gossip, which travels fast and loose, but like water, finding its level, slow, and seeking the lowest point, spreading out once it gets there. It was the end of August when she saw Dale Hutchins again. He came to the farm this time without the clipboard, which was the first thing she noticed. The second thing she noticed was that he came at a time that wasn't business hours, late afternoon, when the county offices were closed. He parked in the yard and got out and looked at the corn, which was now, in sections 1 through 3, above head height and filling out in the ear in a way that made her stomach tighten, with a complicated mix of feelings every time she looked at it. And he stood there for a moment before he turned to face her. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Hutchins." A pause. He wasn't wearing his badge, she noticed, or if he was, it wasn't visible. "I wanted to say," he started, and then stopped, and she could see him working through the construction of whatever it was he'd come to say, the way people do when they prepared something and then found, on arrival, that the prepared version doesn't fit the actual moment. "The assessment I filed," he said, "it was accurate. I want you to know that. I don't adjust assessments based on, I do what the conditions indicate." I know, she said. When I came out here in June, he said, I didn't think. He stopped again. You did your job, she said. The first time and this time. He looked at the corn again, something on his face that she'd never seen there before, or maybe had never looked for before. Not guilt exactly, and not admiration exactly, but the specific expression of a person who has been wrong about something and is standing in the physical evidence of how wrong they were. It's a hell of a thing, he said quietly. Not to her specifically, just into the air between them. Yes, she said. It is. He left after that. She went back to work. The harvest planning started in the first week of September. She needed equipment she didn't have, specifically a combine, which was the singular expensive gap in everything Thomas had owned. His old harvester had given out 3 seasons before he died, and the replacement had never happened because the money had gone to the bank instead. She'd known this problem was coming for months, had filed it in the category of things to solve when she got there, and she was there. She called Art Prentice first because Art Prentice had already demonstrated a willingness to be useful. He had a combine, older but maintained, and he offered it for the week she'd need it in exchange for the 2 bushels of winter squash, plus help with his own harvest the following season, which was the kind of future tense agreement that assumed she'd still be here in farming, which was a form of vote of confidence that cost him nothing and meant something anyway. She took the deal and wrote it in the notebook and thought, one problem at a time. The harvest timing was the next calculation. Corn reads its own readiness in ways you have to know how to see. The silk browning and drying, the husk color shifting from bright to matte, the kernel thumbnail test, where you press your nail into the exposed kernel and look at what comes out. She'd watched Thomas do this 100 times. She'd never done it as the person making the final call. And the first time she pressed her thumbnail into a kernel on Section 1's most advanced ear and saw what she needed to see, she stood there and felt the specific loneliness of having no one to confirm it with. She wrote it in the notebook instead. Section 1, Kernel Moisture Check, September 8th. Dough stage passing to dent. Estimate 2 to 3 weeks to harvest readiness. And then, in the margin, smaller. Thomas would have said the same thing. It was Roy Bassett who came next, and this time the visit had a quality she hadn't encountered from him before. He came without Hargrove, without the formal structure of an offer. He came the way Hap Carter had come after the rain, in a manner that suggested the visit was personal rather than transactional, which with Roy Bassett was such an unfamiliar mode that she watched him get out of his truck, trying to figure out what it meant. He walked to the field edge and stood looking at the corn for a long time before he said anything. I've been farming this valley for 31 years, he said. I've seen dry summers. I've seen men with better equipment and more capital than you lose crops to heat stress that yours survived. He paused. I've been trying to understand the mechanism. The soil holds moisture better when it's been restored, she said. The pig rooting creates a crumb structure that, I know the mechanism, he said. I had someone look it up. I've been trying to understand why it worked as well as it did, the degree of it. He turned to look at her. How deep did the rooting go in the early sections? She thought about it. 8 to 12 inches on average, deeper in the spots where there was old drainage below. He nodded. And the recovery time before you planted? Section 1 had 8 weeks between first pig entry and planting. Section 8 had 9 days. And the difference in yield projection between Section 1 and 8? She'd already done this math. Section 1 is projecting about 40% stronger than Section 8, adjusted for corn stage. He was quiet for a moment. 40%. Not a question. Processing. Roughly, she said. It's not a controlled study, Roy. There are other variables. Still, he said. He looked at the field again. I've got 2 parcels on my south side that have been underperforming for 6 years. I put it down to drainage and soil chemistry, but they've had heavy equipment on them since before I bought them. He stopped. She waited. I'm not asking you to help me, he said carefully. I'm telling you that I'm going to look into this, and that you... He stopped again, which was unusual for Roy Bassett, who was a man who generally knew what he wanted to say. What you did here, he said finally, is going to cost me a significant revision of how I think about 3 of my properties, and I thought you should know that. She looked at him. Is that an apology? It's an acknowledgement, he said. I don't apologize for making reasonable offers based on the information available. Fair enough, she said. He almost smiled. You are a very difficult woman, Evelyn Mercer. Thomas would have agreed with you, she said. He did, frequently. Bassett actually laughed at that. A real one, short and unguarded, the kind that comes out before you decide whether to let it. Then he got back in his truck and drove away, and she stood watching him go and thought that the valley was rearranging itself around what she'd done, slowly, the way soil rearranges around the thing that has moved through it. She sold the pigs in the second week of September to a buyer Carl Finley found, which saved her the trouble of advertising and meant she got a fair price rather than a desperate one. The buyer came with a proper trailer and loaded them efficiently, and she stood at the North Pen gate and watched them go with the feeling she'd described to Tommy, letting it matter while it matters. 27 animals who'd done what pigs do, who'd been loud and difficult and had escaped the fencing more times than she'd documented in the notebook, and who had, in the course of doing exactly what their nature required them to do, helped her save a farm. She watched the trailer go down the gravel drive and turn onto the road and disappear, and the silence that replaced them was immediate and enormous and not unpleasant, and she stood in it for a full minute before she went back to work. The harvest came in the last week of September. Art Prentice brought the combine himself, which she hadn't expected. She'd expected his hired man. And he showed up early on a Monday morning and walked her through his particular way of operating the machine, which had a quirk on the left header that you had to compensate for by adjusting the reel speed, and which he explained twice in the specific detail of a man who is genuinely concerned about his equipment, which she appreciated and told him so. She ran the combine herself on sections 1 through 4. Art ran it on 5 through 8. They worked across from each other, moving in parallel lines through the corn, and the sound of the machine and the smell of the cut stalks and the dry silk and the filled grain bin building toward capacity were sensory facts that she would carry for the rest of her life in the specific preserved way that moments of consequence get stored. By the end of the first day, sections 1 and 2 were done. She stood at the grain wagon at dusk and looked at what had come out of the ground that everyone had called dead, and she felt something enormous and quiet and not entirely describable move through her. And she let it move through her without trying to name it or contain it or hold it back, because there are moments when the correct thing to do is simply to be present in them. Her face was wet when she climbed down from the wagon. She didn't know exactly when that had started. The field was getting dark, and Art Prentice was doing something with the combine header on the far end and couldn't see her, which was probably for the best. She gave herself about 4 minutes, which felt like the right amount, and then she wiped her face on her sleeve and went to help Art close up the equipment for the night. The section yields came in better than projection on sections 1 through 4 and within projection on 5 and 6, and sections 7 and 8 came in at the lower end of what she'd estimated, which was not a surprise and which she'd accounted for in her numbers. By the time the last row of section 8 came through the combine on the third day, she had a total yield figure that she wrote in the notebook in the steady hand of a person who has been waiting to write a specific number for a very long time. It cleared the county debt. It cleared the bank lien. It left a margin, not a large margin. Not the kind of margin that meant she could stop being careful or stop getting up at 4:30 or stop watching the sky with a farmer's particular vigilance, but a margin, a real one. A number that meant next season she would start from a position of ownership rather than survival, which was a different thing in ways that extended beyond accounting. She sat with the total figure for a while at the kitchen table with the notebook open and Thomas's handwriting visible on the opposite page, his numbers and hers on facing pages like a conversation that had been going on for a long time and had arrived finally at a resting place. She picked up the pen and wrote in the margin, next to Thomas's original diagram of the field sections. It worked, all 8 sections. The soil is different. EM, September 2026. Then she closed the notebook and put it back on the shelf and went to make dinner, which she burned slightly because she was thinking about something else, and ate anyway because she was hungry, and did the dishes and turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The farm was quiet around her in the way that farms are quiet at the end of harvest season. A particular settled stillness, like a long exhale, like the land itself taking stock. The north pen where the pigs had been was empty, and the field beyond it was cut to stubble, and the corn was in the bins, and the numbers were in the notebook, and the deed was still in her name. She lay in the center of the too big bed, which was still too big, which she thought probably would always be too big, and she listened to the quiet. Tomorrow there would be things to do, soil tests to run, winter cover crop to consider, equipment to return to Art Prentice, and an arrangement to honor with him the following season. A phone call to her sister that she'd been composing in her head for 2 days. A conversation with Carl Finley about whether the seed arrangement could be formalized for next year. And Hap Carter's idle equipment, which she was now genuinely thinking about rather than just noting for later. Tomorrow there was all of it. Tonight there was just the quiet and the settled field and the number in the notebook and the fact, plain and unadorned, that she was still here. She thought about the morning she'd sat at this table with the county notice in front of her. She thought about Thomas's handwriting. She thought about a 16-year-old boy who'd shown up at the fence line with his hands in his pockets and stayed until the corn was taller than he was. She thought about Carl Finley's grandfather, whoever he'd been, wherever he'd farmed, doing this same thing in the same earth before anyone wrote it into journals. She thought about 27 pigs who had done, without sentiment or agenda, exactly what pigs do. She thought, there are worse things to build a farm on. Then she closed her eyes, and the farm settled around her into its autumn quiet, and she slept without dreaming, which was the best kind of sleep, and the kind she had earned. The morning she drove to town to settle the county debt, she wore her own jacket. It was a small thing. Nobody would have noticed, and nobody did. But she'd been wearing Thomas's canvas work jacket since the week he died. Not as a conscious decision, more the way you reach for something familiar when everything else is unfamiliar. And that morning she'd stood at the coat hooks by the door and looked at both jackets for a moment and chosen her own. It was older than his, thinner at the elbows, and it fit her correctly, which his never had. She drove to the county offices in Harlan with the notebook on the passenger seat and a bank draft in her shirt pocket, and the specific interior quiet of a person who has been bracing for something for so long that the absence of bracing feels strange and requires adjustment. Dale Hutchins was at his desk. He looked up when she came in, and there was a brief moment, just a flicker, where she saw him recognize what she was there for before he rearranged his face into the professional neutrality he wore the way other men wore ties. He took the bank draft. He checked the amount against his records with the careful attention of a man who has made mistakes by rushing and learned not to. Then he stamped the lien release, signed it in 2 places, and handed it across the desk. That clears the county obligation in full, he said. Yes, she said. It does. He held the stamped document out and she took it, and he didn't let go immediately. Just a half second, the faintest resistance, and then he released it. Mrs. Mercer, he said, in a voice that had stepped slightly outside the professional register. For what it's worth. It's worth something, she said, which was honest, and which was also all she was going to give him, and he seemed to understand that because he nodded and looked back at his desk in the way of a man returning to his column of numbers. She drove to the bank next. Prescott with his gray tie was waiting. She'd called ahead, and the transaction took less time than the drive had. She handed over the draft for the remaining lien balance. He processed it with his careful, column-trained precision, and when he slid the lien release across the desk to her, she looked at the total paid figure at the bottom and thought about the number she'd given him 6 months ago, the number that had meant she couldn't borrow further, and how that conversation felt like it had happened to a slightly different person than the one sitting in this chair now. Not dramatically different, just someone who didn't yet know what the soil would do. Congratulations, Prescott said, and meant it in the mild way of a man whose emotions are managed through institutional language, but who is still, underneath, capable of something resembling genuine feeling. Thank you, she said, and meant that too. She was in the parking lot putting the documents in the glove box when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but she answered it because she'd gotten into the habit of answering things rather than avoiding them. Mrs. Mercer? A woman's voice, professionally warm in a way that meant she'd introduced herself to a lot of people on phones. My name is Patricia Vance. I'm a field correspondent with the Harlan County Agricultural Extension Office. I was given your name by Carl Finley. She leaned against the truck. Carl Finley gave you my name. He did. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, which I want you to know because Carl Finley does not say things loosely. He said you'd run what he called the most interesting soil restoration project in the valley in 50 years. A pause. I'd love to come out and see what you did if you're willing. She thought about this for a moment. She thought about the county parking lot she was standing in and the documents in the glove box and the number in the notebook and the stub field that was already being prepared for winter cover crop. She thought about what Patricia Vance asking this question meant, which was that Carl had told someone, and someone had decided it was worth documenting, which was a different kind of thing than Ruth Finley slowing down in the feed store or Hap Carter revising his thinking at the fence line. You can come out, she said. Next week. I've got things to finish first. Of course, said Patricia Vance. Next week is fine. She hung up and sat in the truck for a moment before starting the engine. Carl Finley, she thought. Carl and his grandfather, and his understated certainty and his contact in Baines County, and his one sentence delivered to a woman from the Agricultural Extension Office. She hadn't asked him to do that. He'd done it the way he seemed to do most things, quietly, without announcing it, as a plain extension of believing something was worth doing. She drove home and went back to work. The cover crop went in the following week, winter rye and crimson clover in rotation across the sections, a decision she'd made based on Thomas's notes and her own reading, and a long conversation with Art Prentice, who had strong opinions about cover crops the way he seemed to have strong opinions about most agricultural specifics, delivered with the mild authority of a man who has tested things personally rather than just read about them. The rye would hold the soil structure through winter. The clover would fix nitrogen back into the ground, continuing the restoration process the pigs had started. She was doing the seeding when Patricia Vance arrived. She'd expected someone with a clipboard and a camera and the slightly removed quality of a person who studies things rather than does them. Patricia Vance was not that. She was in her 50s, compact, wearing boots that had been in fields before, and she walked the section edges with an attention that was immediately recognizable as genuine rather than performed. She crouched where Evelyn crouched and pressed her own palm to the earth and looked at what the soil told her palm with the face of a woman who had been reading soil for a long time. They didn't talk much for the first hour. Evelyn showed her the sections, explained the rotation sequence, showed her the notebook, Thomas's entries and her own entries in their different handwritings running together across the pages. Patricia read slowly, turning back occasionally to reread something, asking precise questions when she did speak. Not the questions Evelyn had been expecting, not the broad curious ones, but the specific ones. Depth of rooting by section, days between pig removal and planting, specific kernel moisture readings at harvest, yield differential between early and late sections. You kept very detailed records, Patricia said, looking at the notebook. My husband started the system, Evelyn said. I kept it going. Patricia looked at the page Thomas's diagram was on. She looked at it for a moment without speaking. This was his original plan? He never got to do it, Evelyn said. He got sick. Patricia closed the notebook carefully and handed it back. The yield differential between your earliest processed sections and your latest is what's most significant to me, she said. 40% is not a minor variance. That's a finding. I know. Do you understand what I mean by a finding? Patricia said, not condescendingly, checking the way scientists check. You mean it's documentable and repeatable, and it means something beyond my 50 acres. Patricia looked at her for a moment. Yes, exactly that. She looked at the field. There are 20 farms in this valley using soil management methods that are creating the same compaction problem you inherited. There are hundreds in this state. What you did, the specific combination of rotation timing and pig density and recovery period before planting, that's not in any current extension office literature in a format that practical farmers are actually reading. Evelyn thought about Thomas's notebook, about the agricultural journals he'd read by lamplight, about the particular loneliness of knowing something that other people aren't paying attention to yet. It's old information, she said. Old information that nobody's put numbers on in a practical field context, Patricia said. Not in this region, not in drought conditions. She paused. I'd like to write this up, not just as a case study, as a methodology guide, something farmers can actually use. She looked at Evelyn directly. I'd want your permission and your records, and your name on it, if you're willing. Evelyn thought about this for a long moment. She thought about the notebook and Thomas's name written at the front in his handwriting, and her name written in the margins in hers. She thought about Carl's grandfather, who had apparently done this same thing decades before, and left no record that survived in any usable form, so that Carl knew about it only as a memory of something his grandfather had said and not as a set of instructions anyone could follow. Thomas Mercer's name, too, she said. The methodology came from his notes. Patricia didn't hesitate. Absolutely. They shook hands there in the field, and Evelyn thought about what it meant to name something. How naming it correctly was a form of respect that cost nothing and meant everything, and how often it was withheld not out of cruelty but out of carelessness, which was its own particular kind of wrong. Ruth Finley called on a Thursday in mid-October. Evelyn was in the barn doing winterization work on the irrigation system when her phone rang and Ruth's name appeared on the screen, which gave her a brief, complex reaction that she let pass before she answered. Evelyn? Ruth said in the particular tone she used when she was composing herself into a specific version of a conversation she'd been rehearsing. I wanted to call and say congratulations. On the harvest. Carl mentioned, we heard how it came in. Thank you, Ruth. I want you to know I never... Ruth stopped, regrouped. I was worried about you. That's all it was. When you bought those pigs, I was genuinely worried. I know, Evelyn said. And she did know. She'd always known that Ruth Finley's particular brand of doubt came from a place that was adjacent to concern, even if it wore concern's clothing badly. Some people's love expresses itself as fear of your failure, and the two things get tangled up together until the person expressing it can't tell them apart. It turned out all right, she said, which was the kindest formulation she had available. It did, Ruth said, in a voice that had something in it Evelyn hadn't heard from her before. A quality that wasn't quite humility, because Ruth Finley and humility were not naturally close companions, but was something in that general direction. Carl told me about the extension office woman, that she's going to write it up. Yes. Your name is going to be on it. And Thomas's. A pause. Yes. Good. Another pause. He was always reading those journals, wasn't he? Thomas. Yes, Evelyn said, and felt the familiar sharp and soft of it, the way his name in someone else's mouth did the thing it always did and probably always would do. He was. They said goodbye in the careful way of two women who have been circling each other for years and will probably continue to do so, which was honest, if not entirely comfortable, and Evelyn went back to the irrigation system and kept working. Tommy Fitch came by on a Saturday in late October, this time with his father. She'd never formally met Dale Fitch, though she'd seen him from a distance often enough. He was a lean, weathered man in his 40s who had the look of someone who had been working outdoors his entire life and had opinions about this, but kept most of them to himself. He came to the fence line with Tommy beside him, and he had the posture of a man who has decided to do something he wasn't sure about and has committed to it now that he's in motion. Mrs. Mercer, he said. Dale Fitch. I know who you are, she said, not unkindly. He nodded, looked at the field, the cut stalks, the winter rye already showing the first green fuzz of germination across the sections, the evidence of what the season had been. Then he looked at his son, and whatever passed between them in that glance was the private language of a father and a son who don't say everything directly but say some things without words. Tommy says he learned things here, Dale said. He worked hard, she said. He asked good questions. Dale's jaw moved slightly. He should have been in school. He should have, she agreed. He went when I told him to. Another pause. Dale was looking at the winter rye again, and she could see him processing something. Not just the field, but the accumulation of things the field represented, the things he'd driven past all summer without stopping to understand. He wants to try it, Dale said. The pig rotation. On our north section, next spring. He said it the way a man says something he's still deciding whether to believe in, which was more honest than the alternative. She looked at Tommy, who was looking at the rye germinating in Section 1 and trying to appear like he wasn't paying close attention to this conversation, which he clearly was. He knows how, she said. He watched every section. He knows what to look for. Dale absorbed this. Would you be... He stopped. Started again. If he had questions. He can come ask me, she said. That's not a problem. Dale nodded. He stuck his hand out over the fence and she shook it, which was the plainest possible language and which meant what it meant. Then he put his hand on Tommy's shoulder briefly. Just briefly. The kind of touch that fathers give sons when something has shifted between them and they don't have the words for it, and walked back to his truck. Tommy stayed at the fence for a moment. He looked like he wanted to say something and wasn't sure what. You're going to mess it up the first time, she told him. Everybody does. The pigs will escape and the rotation timing will be off and something you didn't expect will happen. He looked at her. What do you do when that happens? You fix what you can and write down what you couldn't, and you adjust the next section based on what you learned. She paused. That's the whole method, Tommy. That's all it is. He thought about this. That's not very complicated. No, she said. It's not. The complicated part is not quitting when the thing you didn't expect turns out to be worse than you planned for. He nodded slowly, with the seriousness of someone who understood she wasn't just talking about pigs. He went back to his father's truck, and they drove off down the road, and she stood at the fence line watching them go and felt something that she'd felt a handful of times in her life. The specific feeling of having passed something forward. Not a lesson exactly, because she'd never set out to teach. More like a direction. A way of standing in front of a problem. The thing Thomas had given her, which his notebooks had given her, which she was now somehow giving to a 16-year-old boy and his skeptical father, and through Patricia Vance's documentation to farmers she'd never meet. Things move through people the way water moves through soil. You can't always see it happening. You only know it by what grows afterward. She went inside and made dinner and didn't burn it this time, which felt like a small personal victory, and sat at the kitchen table with the notebook closed in front of her and thought about the coming winter. The cover crops were in. The soil test she'd ordered had come back with numbers that Patricia Vance had described as remarkable, and which Evelyn had described privately as exactly what Thomas's notes had predicted, which was its own form of vindication, even if she was the only one who fully understood it in those terms. She needed to look at the equipment situation. Hap Carter's idle machinery was a conversation she'd been meaning to have properly, and next spring's planning would require decisions about what she could manage alone and what she needed to arrange differently. She was not afraid of those decisions. She had been afraid of them in June when they had seemed like problems belonging to a different and more capable person than herself. They didn't seem that way anymore. They seemed like what they were, practical problems with practical components that yielded to patient, systematic attention. She was not the same woman who had sat at this table with the county notice flat in front of her and felt the ground giving way beneath everything. She knew this. She'd known it since sometime in July, sometime between Section 4 and Section 5, and the first time she pressed her palm to turn soil and felt the difference. What she hadn't fully understood until recently was what specifically had changed. It wasn't confidence, not exactly. She'd been confident before, in smaller ways, in contexts that didn't require this particular quality of sustained conviction. It wasn't strength, because she'd always been strong, and strength on its own would not have been sufficient. What had changed was something quieter and more structural. She trusted her own judgment now in the specific way that comes only from having used it under pressure, and found that it held. That was Thomas's gift to her, in the end. Not the diagram, not the method, not even the notebooks. Those were tools. The gift was the model of a person who looked at the world with the specific, unglamorous curiosity of someone who believes that careful attention will eventually tell you what you need to know, who reads the evidence in front of them rather than the consensus around them, who writes things down, not because anyone is watching, but because the act of writing makes the scene more exact. She'd tried to be that person this summer. She hadn't always managed it. There had been mornings when the math had felt unsurvivable, Evenings when the drought sat over everything like a hand pressing down, and she'd lain awake constructing Roy Bassett's version of her future because her own version had felt too fragile to hold. There had been a day in the second week of August when she'd stood in Section 7 and looked at the heat-stressed plants there and felt a despair so complete it had a specific texture, not like falling, more like being stood in cement. She'd gotten up the next morning anyway, not because she'd resolved the despair, not because she'd found a reason that made the despair irrelevant, just because the alternative was lying in bed while the plants in Section 7 received no water, and that was unacceptable. And so she'd gotten up and put on her boots and gone out. That's the thing nobody tells you about the hardest periods of your life. You don't get through them by feeling better. You get through them by doing the next thing while still feeling bad. And then the thing after that, until at some point the doing and the feeling have separated enough that you can function in the gap between them. It's not inspiration. It's not courage. Not in the romantic sense. It's something much more ordinary and much harder to celebrate. It's just continuing, in the specific plain way of a person who has decided that continuing is what they're doing. She'd continued. And the corn had come in. And the debt was paid. And the soil was different. The farm entered October quietly, the way farms do after harvest. A settling, a stillness. The particular piece of land that has done what it was going to do for the season and has been given permission to rest. She walked the fields in the evening sometimes, just to walk them, not checking anything specific. The winter rye was coming up green across the sections in the slanted October light, a fuzz of living color over the dark-turned earth, and she'd stand at the edge of Section 1 and look at it and feel something uncomplicated and deep that she didn't try to name. She had the deed. It was in the drawer under the silverware, where she kept documents that had been handled. Hap Carter came by on a Wednesday in the first week of November. He came in the mid-morning, which told her it was a chosen time rather than a passing by, and he had a folder under his arm that turned out to contain equipment records, specifications, maintenance histories, the kind of paperwork that accompanies a serious offer rather than a casual conversation. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee between them, and he laid out what he was thinking, which was a use arrangement for his idle combine and disc harrow for her spring prep and next fall's harvest, in exchange for a share of yield at a percentage he named, which was fair. Not generous, fair. Which was what she'd expected from Hap Carter, and which she preferred to generosity, because generosity creates obligations that fairness doesn't. She read the equipment records, which told her the combine had been serviced recently, and the disc harrow needed a belt she could source from the county equipment co-op for under $50. She asked 3 questions. He answered them without patting. She told him she'd think about it and let him know by the end of the week, and he said that was fine, and finished his coffee and left without pushing for a faster answer, which confirmed for her that he was a man who could be dealt with straightforwardly. She called him Thursday and said yes. He said good. That was the entirety of the call. She wrote the arrangement in the notebook. Then she looked at the page for a moment, her handwriting filling in around Thomas's original notes, the two of them running together across the whole document now. The early sections mostly his, and the later sections mostly hers, with a long overlap in the middle where they were mixed. And she thought about what the notebook had been when she'd first taken it off the shelf in June, and what it was now. It had been his book. Now it was their book. Maybe eventually it would become something else. A reference document that Tommy Fitch's son read someday, or a piece of the methodology Patricia Vance was writing up, or just a physical object that survived and got passed forward the way objects sometimes do, carrying information that the people who made them didn't know they were preserving. She didn't know which. She put it back on the shelf. November moved in the way of late-year months in the valley, shorter days, harder mornings, the kind of cold that settles rather than blows. She did the winterization work methodically, the way Thomas had always done it, moving through the farm's infrastructure in the sequence he had described once, and she'd remembered. The irrigation pipes came out and got stored. The barn got its winter prep. The equipment she was responsible for was sheltered and covered. The cover crop grew across the fields in the slow, steady way of plants that are doing their work in the cold without needing to be watched. She was in the barn on a Thursday afternoon when she found his work gloves. She hadn't been looking for them. She'd been looking for a specific wrench and had gone through a storage box that hadn't been opened since probably before he got sick, and there at the bottom of the box were his gloves. Heavy canvas, worn through at the right thumb from the particular way he held tools, with his initials in black marker on the inside of the left wrist, the way some farmers mark their things so they don't walk off at equipment shares. TM. She held them in her hands for a moment. She didn't try to do anything with what she felt. She just held them and felt it. The full weight of the year, the full weight of the person who was absent from it, the full weight of all the mornings she'd gotten up and put her boots on and gone out to do the next thing while still feeling the absence as a constant low-level fact of her existence. None of that went away. She'd never thought it would. You don't get over the people you've built your life with. You build around them, which is different, and you carry them forward in the ways you carry things, in habits and knowledge, and the particular angles you look at problems from. She put his gloves on the shelf above the workbench, next to the wrench she'd eventually found, and went back to what she'd been doing. Dinner was soup from the garden vegetables she'd put up in September, which was the first year she'd done any serious food preservation, and which had not gone perfectly. 2 of the jars had sealed badly, and she'd lost them, but which had gone well enough that she had a shelf of legitimate winter food in the pantry, which was something. She sat at the kitchen table and ate and looked at the notebook on the shelf and thought about next spring. There were things to decide. The north section could potentially be expanded. She'd done the soil tests and the numbers suggested the restoration had been effective enough that a larger planting footprint was viable. She could source another group of piglets in February and run a smaller second rotation on the sections that had gone in last in the original sequence, deepening the restoration there. She needed to think about what to plant beyond corn. The winter squash she'd promised Art Prentice could go in sections 3 and 4, where the soil was richest now. She'd been reading Thomas's notes on crop rotation and thinking about whether a portion of the land could go to a different yield altogether. And there was the question of help, not Tommy, who had school and his own farm's needs now that his father was trying the pig method, but the possibility of a hired hand in the peak season, someone who could work under direction, which would require money she'd need to budget for beginning in February. She wrote all of this in the notebook. Not plans exactly, more like the beginning of plans. Rough shapes that would need more thought before they became decisions. But the writing itself was something. The writing said, "There is a next season. There is a spring to plan for. There is a future that belongs to this farm and to the woman running it, and the woman running it is me." She put the notebook down and sat with her soup and looked out the kitchen window at the dark fields under the November sky. She thought about the orange stake. Dale Hutchins had pulled it out of the ground when he filed his assessment in August, which she'd known was procedure and which she'd felt physically as the removal of something that had been lodged in her since the morning he drove it in. She'd found the hole it left in the ground the next day, a small, round absence in the soil of Section 1. She'd filled it in with her boot without thinking about it, just pressed the turned earth back into the gap and kept walking, which seemed like the appropriate response to most absences if you could manage it. Not ignoring them, not making monuments of them, just acknowledging the shape of the space and walking forward. She rinsed her bowl and turned off the kitchen light and stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall for a moment, looking at the coat hooks. His jacket was still there. She hadn't moved it. She probably wouldn't. It was his jacket, and it had lived on that hook for years, and she didn't see a reason to change where it lived. She had her own jacket for the cold and his for the memory, which was not weakness and not sentimentality. It was just honesty about what things are. Some things you keep not because you're holding on, but because letting go entirely would mean pretending something didn't matter that did. She went to bed early, the way she'd been going to bed since the harvest. A body that has spent a season working at its limits learns to take sleep when it's offered. She lay in the center of the bed and looked at the ceiling for a while in the particular way of a person who has a lot to think about but is too tired to think about all of it at once. One thing resolved into focus before the rest dissolved into sleep. She'd been turning it over for weeks without quite landing on it, and now it came clear in the simple language of something that has been waiting for the right moment to be understood. Thomas had written not fashionable, but it works about an old method that the world had mostly set aside in favor of expensive equipment and chemical intervention. He'd written it without knowing she'd be the one to read it, without knowing she'd need it. without knowing that his careful, curious attention to unglamorous practical truth would be the thing that kept his farm in his family's hands after he was gone. People spend a lot of time wondering what they'll leave behind. They think about the big things: property, money, the kind of achievements that get said over you at the end. Thomas had left her this farm, and this debt, and these fields, which on the surface looked like a burden, and which were also, at the same time, without contradiction, the only reason she'd had to discover what she was capable of. He'd left her the notebooks. He'd left her the method. He'd left her the model of a person who paid exact, humble, unglamorous attention to the truth in front of them, rather than the fashionable version of it. She didn't know if that's what he'd meant to leave. Probably he'd meant to leave her a working farm and a marriage that went on until they were old, which is what she'd meant to have. But you don't always get what you meant to have. Sometimes you get what the situation requires, and sometimes what the situation requires turns out to be more than you knew you had in you, and sometimes the person who knew you had it in you is gone by the time you find out. She understood now, clearly, that the farm had saved her as much as she had saved it. There was no clean line between those two things. You go into the ground and you change it and it changes you, and neither of you is what you were before. That's not a metaphor. That's agriculture. That's also, she thought, just life. In the plainest terms, if you're paying attention. She closed her eyes. The farm was quiet. The cover crop was growing in the dark. Somewhere in the county, in a file cabinet in the extension office, Patricia Vance was beginning to organize notes that would eventually become a document with 2 names on it, and one of those names was Thomas Mercer, and that was the correct and true thing, and it would go forward from here into hands neither of them could see. The fields were resting. They were different fields than they had been in June. Not perfect, not finished, not arrived at any final condition, because fields don't work that way, and neither do people. But changed. Genuinely changed. In the lasting way of things that have been worked at the right depth for long enough. The debt was paid. The deed was in the drawer. The notebooks were on the shelf. And for the first time since the morning everything broke open, Evelyn Mercer lay in the bed that was still too big and felt not the absence shaped like Thomas, which was still there and would always be there, but something alongside it. Something that had grown up in the same ground, in the same difficult season, fed by the same stubborn refusal to let the land go. She felt simply and without drama, like herself. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything. The winter came in the way winters come to working farms, not as an ending, but as a pause between things, a held breath before the turning of the year. The rye grew slowly in the cold. The soil rested and rebuilt, and the woman who had changed it and been changed by it slept in her house at the center of the land that was hers, and let the season be what it was, and waited for spring.